Every town has its secrets. Some are buried in basements, whispered in back alleys, or locked behind forgotten doors. But in the sleepy town of Greybridge, the most terrifying secret has stood right out in the open for generations. At the center of an overgrown park, covered in moss and half-forgotten stories, there's a statue no one dares touch. Not because of superstition, not because of some old legend, but because every full moon it turns. No one's ever moved it. No one's ever caught it in motion. But every month, like clockwork, it's facing a new direction. Eyes locked on a different path, arms slightly raised, head tilted in uncanny ways that send shivers down your spine. And every generation, someone new starts asking the wrong question. Now tell me this, would you dare walk past it on a full moon night? Or better yet, would you stay to watch? If you're as hooked as we are by this eerie mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. In 1897, Greybridge was no more than a fog-shrouded village, tucked between thick forests and forgotten roads. The air hung damp with mist, and the only light came from gas lamps that flickered like they were afraid of the dark. Locals didn't wander after sundown, not just because of wolves or bandits, but because of the park. Cresswell Park had been there longer than the town itself. No one planted the trees, but they grew in perfect spiral. No one built the cobblestone paths, yet they formed intricate loops, too deliberate to be accidents. At the park's heart stood the statue, a figure of weathered stone, nearly 8 feet tall, cloaked, hooded, one hand raised as if asking for silence, the other hidden beneath heavy robes. Its face was featureless, smooth and blank like a mask without eye holes. Townsfolk said it had always been there. Generations before had passed down the warning. Never enter the park on the night of a full moon. Thomas Whitmore had never been good at listening. At 17, he was restless, a lean, sharp-eyed boy with coal-black hair and bruised knuckles from too many bar brawls. He lived with his grandfather, Elias, a retired gravedigger, who never spoke above a whisper. Elias warned Thomas the night before, like he always did. "You stay away from that park, lad," he rasped, his hands trembling as he wrapped the same rosary he'd held for 30 years. "That thing in the center, it watches, it remembers." Thomas had laughed. "You mean the statue? Come on, Granddad. It's a rock, nothing more." But that night, with a full moon hanging above Greybridge like a silver coin spilled from heaven, Thomas slipped into the park with nothing but a lantern and a daredevil grin. The air was unnaturally still. Even the trees didn't sway. His boots made no sound on the path. He reached the clearing. There it stood, exactly like he remembered. Yet he didn't remember it facing this way. It was looking down the path that led toward his grandfather's cottage. The lantern flickered. Thomas blinked. The statue hadn't moved, but something felt off. The posture seemed slightly different. The hand raised to shush the world looked higher, almost like it was signaling him. His breath misted out in long, nervous clouds. "Creepy old thing," he muttered. He circled it slowly, daring himself close. Moss had grown thick around its base, and old vines wrapped around the hem of the robe like leeches clinging to flesh. He reached out, hesitating only briefly, then placed his hand on the stone. It was warm. Warm. He yanked back like he'd touched a stove. Behind him, something whispered. He spun around. Nothing. The wind howled suddenly through the trees, but the branches remained still. Then he heard it again, low, gravelly, and filled with breath. "Thomas." He staggered back, heart racing, eyes wide as saucers. The statue's blank face was now tilted, only slightly, but toward him. "No, no, no," he said, stumbling. "That wasn't like that. It wasn't." The lantern sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed him. From the trees came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. He turned and ran, not caring about the path, crashing through underbrush and thorns. Branches clawed at him like fingers. He didn't stop until he burst out of the park and into the muddy roads of Greybridge. He didn't sleep that night, and when he told Elias what he'd seen, the old man paled. He sat in silence, then stood and opened a rusted trunk beneath his bed. Inside was a bundle of yellowed newspaper clippings and a leather journal with the Whitmore family crest. Thomas watched as his grandfather pulled out an article dated June 3rd, local boy missing, last seen near Cresswell Park. Under it was another from a young woman found dead, statue now pointed at her door. Every 20 or 30 years the pattern repeated. And always the same statue, always a turning, always during the full moon. There's something buried under it, Elias whispered, eyes wide. Your great-grandfather tried to dig. He struck iron. Then the voices started. He cut off his own ears with a sickle 3 days later. Thomas couldn't speak. His hands trembled. The next full moon, Elias vanished. No sign of a struggle. No blood, just his rosary, left at the edge of the park. The statue had turned again, its finger no longer raised to silence, but pointing directly at Thomas's window. The years that followed Elias Whitmore's disappearance were etched in grief. Greybridge felt different, darker, emptier, like a place that had been sucked dry of its life force. And in the aftermath of that tragic event, Thomas couldn't escape the nagging questions about his grandfather's fate, nor the curse that hung over Cresswell Park. He didn't have the courage to return there, but the full moons became harder to ignore. It was 1910, and Thomas was now a grown man, hardened by loss, yet still haunted by his family's legacy. He had taken over the small general store his grandfather once ran, a business that now barely kept the wolves at bay. The townsfolk had slowly stopped talking about the statue. It was as though everyone had simply accepted that it was a thing of the past, some strange part of history that couldn't be understood, so it was best left ignored. But not Thomas. He couldn't forget. The night of the full moon had arrived again, and though the thought made him uneasy, something deeper called to him. He could feel it in his bones, some urge to solve the riddle, to understand why that damned statue turned, why people had disappeared. Was it all coincidence, or was there truly something supernatural at play? So he found himself standing at the gates of Cresswell Park, alone, like so many others before him. His lantern swayed in his grip, the wind biting at his face. He had come to find answers. He had come to confront whatever haunted this place. The moon hung low, casting an eerie light across the park, bathing everything in a ghostly glow. The trees were like towering, skeletal sentinels, their limbs reaching up as though trying to scrape the sky. The path leading deeper into the park seemed to stretch unnaturally long before him. Thomas clenched his fists and walked forward. The statue waited for him in the heart of the clearing. It stood still, almost too still, and yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it knew he was here, that it had been waiting for him. The air around it crackled with an odd tension, as though something alive stirred beneath its stone surface. His heart began to pound in his chest. He walked around the statue, his eyes scanning it with a mixture of curiosity and dread. It hadn't changed in appearance, but it felt wrong. The stone had a strange texture under his fingers, like it wasn't stone at all, more like skin. A sound broke the silence, the rustling of leaves. No wind, a voice. Thomas. His body froze. The voice was low, deep, like something rising from the earth itself. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the statue. Its head remained tilted forward, its hands still hidden in its robes. The whisper came again, louder this time, as though it was emanating from the very ground beneath his feet. Thomas Whitmore. A chill ran down his spine. His legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The statue seemed to grow taller, its shadow stretching across the clearing, swallowing the pale moonlight. You can't escape it. His breath quickened. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the air grew thicker, heavier. It was suffocating. And then, out of the corner of his eye, something moved. A dark shape darted between the trees. He jerked his head, but nothing was there. It was just the trees, swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. His eyes returned to the statue. It was different. The hand that had always been raised to silence the world was now pointed toward the dark shape, pointing at the trees, pointing at the place Thomas had seen the movement. His pulse quickened. and his legs screamed for him to run. But he stayed rooted to the spot. It didn't sound like it was coming from the statue now. It was in his mind. You'll be next. The words weren't just words. They were a promise, a threat, and something in them echoed the past, the whispers his grandfather had heard before he disappeared. Then, movement. The statue's head turned, just a fraction, but enough to make Thomas stagger back, his throat tightening with fear. The stone fingers seemed to twitch as if in preparation to reach out. His breath was shallow, his legs trembling. He took a step back, then another, and then suddenly, a flash of light, brighter than the moon, colder than ice. The world shifted. Thomas didn't know how or why, but he suddenly felt as though the park was stretching. The edges of his vision blurred. His surroundings, trees, statues, paths, began to distort, like a nightmare unfolding before him. Shadows twisted into shapes that didn't belong. It wasn't just the statue turning. The park was alive. In a panic, he turned and bolted. His feet pounded the ground, but the park itself seemed to fight him. Every step he took felt like he was wading through tar. The trees bent inward, their branches reaching like arms, clawing at him, pulling him back. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran, desperate to escape whatever was happening. Behind him a voice rose from the shadows, colder and darker than anything he'd ever heard. You can never leave. And then, everything went silent. Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the park, panting, his eyes wide. The full moon above shone as if nothing had happened. But when he looked back at the clearing, the statue had turned completely, now staring directly at him. The fingers of its stone hand, still outstretched, pointed right at his chest. It wasn't just pointing, it was inviting him. Thomas didn't sleep that night. When the early light of morning broke over Greybridge, it didn't bring comfort. It only deepened the shadows in his mind. He spent hours pacing in his small, creaky room above the general store, the image of the statue's cold, stone gaze seared into his memory. He had to know more. There were whispers in town, little things that Thomas hadn't thought to ask before, small details buried beneath the surface. In hushed tones, people talked about the park, but they spoke like it was something they'd learned to ignore, something that didn't belong to them. They'd stopped acknowledging the full moon's power, but Thomas couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. His grandfather had been right all along. There was something underneath that stone, something older than the town itself. The next day, with the sun still low in the sky, he visited the old town library. The smell of mildew and dust filled the air. As he dug through the tattered files and aged books, he'd found something about the statue, an old journal entry from someone named Henry Thorne, a man who had lived in Greybridge during its early years. Thorne's entry was nearly illegible, but there was a single line that caught Thomas's eye. The statue is a gateway, and it hungers for the souls of the foolish who trespass. It will turn and you will hear it calling, but you must not answer. If you do, the darkness will consume you. The words sent a chill down Thomas's spine. The reference to the gateway was unsettling. Was it possible? Had his grandfather been right to warn him? Had Elias disappeared because he had been too close to uncovering whatever secret lay hidden within the statue's stone? Thomas didn't stop there. He tracked down the oldest living resident of Greybridge, a woman named Agnes Blackwood. She was in her late 80s, hunched and frail, but her sharp eyes burned with a fire that belied her age. Her house was on the outskirts of town, near the edge of the forest. She welcomed him with a wary smile and a cup of tea. After some initial small talk, Thomas cut straight to the point. He needed to know what she knew about the statue in Cresswell Park. Agnes stared at him for a long moment, her hands trembling as she set the teacup down. "You're not the first to come asking," she said, her voice low and rough. "But it's not a story for the faint of heart." She sighed heavily, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse to tell him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "When I was a girl, I used to play in that park. Back then, there were stories, of course, but we didn't believe them. We thought it was just a story passed down to scare children, nothing more. But then things started to change." She looked up at him, her eyes darkening. "People started disappearing. First it was one or two, then whole families. Some would leave, only to come back with strange looks in their eyes. Others would vanish for weeks, And when they returned, they didn't speak a word. Not one. Did anyone ever figure out what was happening? Thomas asked, his pulse quickening. Agnes's lips quivered, and she leaned closer. It was always the full moon. That's when the statue would move. It turned slowly at first, just a shift in the way it stood, but then it grew faster, more deliberate. It was like the statue was watching, waiting, and then one night we saw it. Thomas leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat. Saw what? The eyes, or what looked like eyes, though they weren't eyes at all. The stone had cracked, just enough to reveal something behind it. Something alive. That was when we realized. It wasn't just a statue. It was something more, something old. I don't know if it was a god or a demon. But I know this. It didn't like being ignored. Thomas felt the air around him thicken. The idea that the statue had once moved, that it had been alive or at least had some life within it, terrified him. Why didn't anyone stop it? Why didn't they tear it down? Agnes shook her head slowly. Because when the statue calls, you have to listen. It's part of the curse. No one can destroy it. Those who tried, well, they disappeared too. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. I know who will be next. Thomas stood up abruptly, his heart racing. Who? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to the window, her expression distant. When she spoke again, it was like she was speaking to someone else, someone far away. The full moon's coming. You'll see it for yourself. You'll know when it calls to you. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air as Thomas left her house. The dread that gnawed at him all afternoon now felt like a living thing, crawling under his skin. The statue wasn't just a sentinel. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a presence. And whatever it wasn't bound by the rules of time or logic. He had to go. By the time night fell, Thomas was already making his way to the park. The moon was a silver disk in the sky, casting an unnatural glow over the town. He felt it again, the pull, the call. His footsteps were silent on the path, and his breath misted in the cold air. The park was still, like a graveyard waiting to swallow him whole. And then, standing in the clearing, he saw it. The statue. This time it was different. The stone had begun to crack. At first it was just a small fissure, barely noticeable. But it grew rapidly, like some unseen force was tearing it apart from the inside. The cracks spread across the surface, and within them something stirred. A shadow darker than the night itself seemed to pulse beneath the stone. Then it happened. The statue's hand, the hand that had been raised for so long in silence, moved. Not slowly, not gently. It slashed through the air, like it was cutting the very fabric of reality. Thomas screamed as the ground beneath him shifted. The air was thick with a smell he couldn't identify, but it was putrid, rotting, decaying. And then the eyes appeared. Two black voids, staring at him from within the stone. You should never have come back, the voice whispered. But it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was the wind, the earth, the darkness. It was everything. Thomas fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the ground trembled beneath him. Thomas couldn't breathe. The air around him seemed to thicken, like the very atmosphere was closing in on him, suffocating him. The statue, no, it wasn't just a statue anymore, loomed in front of him, its stone hands trembling, its cracks widening. Inside, the darkness shifted like something alive, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment. He crawled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, each breath jagged and shallow. His legs were weak, trembling, as if the earth itself was pulling at him, trying to drag him deeper into the ground. His mind raced, screaming for him to get out, to escape, but his body wouldn't obey. Then a low hum began to vibrate beneath the ground. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a deep, unsettling pulse that seemed to come from the very core of the earth, resonating through his bones. The statue's eyes, those black, empty voids, seemed to see him staring straight into his soul, pulling him close. Thomas's hands clawed at the ground, pushing himself away from the figure. But it was as if the park itself was turning against him. The earth was soft and wet, pulling at his fingers, sucking him in. His chest tightened, a terrible pressure building within him, and he felt his vision blur. It's too late, the voice whispered again. This time it wasn't in his head, It was in the very air all around him. It had no mouth, no shape, yet it was everywhere. Too late to stop it. Too late to escape. The ground rumbled beneath him. The statue's hand, once raised in a gesture of warning, now reached down toward him, fingers curling like a claw, and Thomas screamed as he tried to scramble to his feet. But it was no use. He couldn't run, he couldn't move. The weight of the park was pressing against him, the shadows closing in, and the only thing left was the statue. "You cannot leave," the voice said. It wasn't a threat anymore, it was a promise. The moonlight flickered, casting harsh shadows across the clearing, and the statue shifted again. It moved with a terrible, unnatural speed. The cracks in its stone surface spread wider, and beneath those cracks, Thomas could see something real, something that didn't belong in this world. The statue was no longer just a figure made of rock. It was alive, or at the very least, it had been awake for far longer than Thomas had imagined. A low growl rumbled from deep within the earth, and Thomas felt a sharp tug at his chest. It was as if the very air around him was pulling him toward the statue. His body screamed in resistance, but it was no use. The statue's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like it was calling him to come closer, to look into its depths. "No," Thomas gasped, trying to push himself back again, but his fingers only sank deeper into the soft, wet earth. And then, it spoke again. You should have listened when the others warned you." The voice was soft now, almost sympathetic. But Thomas knew better than to trust it. It was part of the curse, part of whatever evil lay within this place. This statue had been the curse, had always been the curse, and he had walked right into it, just as everyone else had before him. His mind reeled. He needed to do something. He needed to stop it before it consumed him. But the statue wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him to make a mistake, to fall. That's when he realized the truth. The statue wasn't turning because it was alive. It was turning because it fed. It fed on the souls of those who dared trespass, who dared challenge its power. And when it turned, when it reached out toward them, it consumed them, just like it had consumed his grandfather, just like it had consumed everyone else. It wasn't just a statue, it was a gateway, a prison, and those who stared into its eyes, who listened to its whispers, were pulled into it, into whatever lay beyond. The soul of the one who disappeared was trapped there. It was a part of the park, a part of the statue itself. Thomas had become the next. With sudden clarity, he realized what he had to do. He didn't have much time. The earth beneath him pulsed again, but this time it was different. The pulse wasn't just a warning, it was a signal that the statue was preparing to claim him. Thomas tried to stand, his body shaking violently from the energy surging through the ground. He pushed himself to his feet, and just as he was about to make a run for it, he saw something in the distance, a figure moving toward him. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the backdrop of the trees, but it grew clearer as it approached. It was a man, tall, wearing tattered clothes with a face that was gaunt and hollow. His eyes were black, empty voids, just like the statues. "It was Elias, Granddad," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. But the figure didn't answer, it didn't even move. It just stood there, watching him. And then, from behind the figure, a series of shadows rose from the ground, twisting, writhing like serpents, reaching for Thomas with outstretched hands. He had no time left. The air around him was growing colder, and the shadows closed in. The voice from the statue spoke again, its tone now thick with hunger. "You will join us." Desperation surged through Thomas's veins. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the one thing he had left, his grandfather's rose. The old, weathered beads felt cold in his hand as he gripped them tightly, muttering the words his grandfather had once said to him, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." But before he could finish the prayer, the shadows swarmed around him, and the statue's hand slammed into the earth beside him. Everything went dark. Thomas's world spun in darkness. It wasn't the kind of darkness that existed in the absence of light. It was deeper, more alive, like a consuming void. The air was thick, impossibly heavy, pressing down on him from all sides. His chest ached, as if someone were sitting on top of him, forcing the very breath out of his lungs. He reached out into the blackness, but his hands found nothing, no walls, no ground. It was like being lost inside the belly of some great ancient beast. The last thing he remembered was the touch of the statue's stone hand, cold, slick, and alive. The moment it had made contact with his body, he had felt a wave of excruciating cold shoot through him, a sensation so profound that it had torn his mind away from itself. The rosary, the prayer, had been his last act of defiance. And then, nothing. His eyelids fluttered open, but the world around him remained dark. His body was stiff, unyielding. The smell of earth, wet and fetid, filled his nostrils, mingling with the faint scent of decay. "You should not have resisted," the voice whispered, low and soft, like a caress. It was not the voice of the statue now. It was something else, something old. The words reverberated inside his skull, reverberated through every inch of his being, as if the voice were coming from within his very cells. It made his skin crawl. He forced himself to sit up, struggling against the weight that seemed to press down on him. And then he saw it, a faint, ghostly light glowing in the distance, a pale, sickly glow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Slowly, cautiously, he crawled toward it, his muscles protesting the movement. The cold beneath him was slick and wet, but he couldn't tell if it was water or something else, something darker. His every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but he couldn't bring himself to turn away from the light. It was the only thing in this terrible place that seemed real. As he neared the source of the light, the air grew colder. He could see it now, a crack in the ground, wide enough for a person to crawl through. The light came from deep within the crack, glowing softly, pulsating like a heartbeat. It felt wrong, like a wound, a tear in the fabric of reality. Without thinking, he lowered his body into the crack, moving with an urgency that came from some deep instinct. The further he went, the more the air seemed to compress around him, as if the earth itself was pressing in. His breath became shallow, his head spinning, but he pushed forward. The light grew brighter, the sound of his heartbeat louder in his ears. And then suddenly he was there. He found himself standing in a vast, cavernous space, the walls of which seemed to stretch infinitely upward. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a place that belonged to this world at all. The light was everywhere, but it was unnatural, cold, like the gleam of a dying star. The walls of the cavern were made of stone. No, not stone. Flesh. Thick, pulsing, living flesh. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with every moment, as though they were alive. The very air was alive, teeming with the weight of something that he couldn't name. It was as if he had stepped into the belly of some monstrous entity, its innards laid bare, pulsing with dark energy. "You have crossed the threshold." The voice came again, but now it was all around him. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence, a force filling every inch of the space. It felt like 1,000 voices were speaking at once, their words overlapping and twisting, making it impossible to understand. But somehow he understood. The statue had never been the end. It was the beginning. The floor beneath his feet was slick with something that moved, wriggled, like worms or something worse. As he took a step forward, he could feel the walls shifting, the fleshy skin rippling as if it were reaching for him, wanting to pull him deeper into the cavern. The sensation was nauseating, like being inside something that was both dead and alive at the same time. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said again, its tone softer, almost mournful. "Now you will understand what the others never did, what they never saw." Thomas's eyes snapped open in terror as a ripple, ran through the cavern. The walls trembled, the light flickering in time with the pulse of the stone flesh. The air was filled with the sickening sound of something moving beneath him, stretching, shifting. He turned, and that was when he saw them. Figures, faces, half-formed, drifting through the air. Their bodies were twisted and warped, their limbs stretched out like grotesque marionettes. They floated in the air like ghosts, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths open in silent scream. They were trapped here, just like him, souls who had wandered too close to the statue and been pulled into the same fate. The cracks in their faces, some of them, had been here for centuries. Their bodies were fused with the cavern itself, their eyes empty, locked onto him as he backed away, horrified. "We all serve the same purpose," one of them said, their voice a rasp. "We are the keepers, the hungry ones, and now, you are one of us." Before Thomas could even react, something grabbed him. A cold hand made of stone clutched his wrist, pulling him toward the center of the cavern. The walls shuddered, and the floor cracked open, revealing a pool of liquid that was thick and black, like oil, like tar, but worse, alive, pulsing. It was the center of the statue's curse, the heart of it all. Thomas felt himself being dragged, pulled toward the dark liquid. His body screamed for him to break free, but the hand, the stone hand, tightened around him, refusing to let go. And then as the light grew brighter, the voice spoke once more. "You will become part of the stone, part of the curse, and you will never leave." Thomas's pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the stone hand around his wrist tightening, its unyielding grip pulling him further into the heart of the cavern, toward the dark, oily liquid that writhed like a living thing. The blackness of the pool seemed to reach out for him, beckoning him closer as though it was hungry. The air grew even colder, the scent of decay stronger, and the figures those twisted souls caught forever in their tortured forms watched him with hollow, longing eyes. They had been here for so long. They were waiting for him to join them. "Let me go," Thomas gasped, his voice cracking with fear. He tried to jerk his arm free, but the stone hand wouldn't let go. It was stronger than any force he had ever known, binding him to this place, pulling him into its embrace. The walls of the cavern continued to pulse and shift around him, their fleshy surfaces writhing like something alive, something that shouldn't be. Thomas felt the weight of the stone statue's curse settle deeper into his bones, as if the very essence of it was fusing with him, sinking into the marrow of his soul. His vision blurred as the voices around him swirled in a cacophony, pushing him toward the edge of madness. "We are bound to it just as you will be," whispered one of the floating figures, its face a grotesque, distorted mask of anguish. "The curse does not end, it spreads, until there is nothing left. We were once like you. Now we are the forgotten. You are the next keeper." Another voice joined in, faint but insistent. "You will watch. You will wait. You will turn when it calls." The words made Thomas shudder, but they also made something else stir deep within him. A fragment of memory, something his grandfather had once said, something that made his skin crawl now as he recalled it. "You must never let it claim you, Thomas. Never give in to it, because once you do, it won't stop. You'll become part of the curse, part of the stone, part of the hunger that never ends." He had to fight. He had to resist. With a desperate surge of strength, Thomas tore his arm free of the stone hand, feeling the jagged edges of the stone scrape against his skin as he pulled away. The hand released him, but the moment it did, he staggered, almost falling into the pool. His legs were weak, trembling with exhaustion, but he forced himself to step back, his mind racing. "You can't escape," the voice said again, more insistent, more powerful. "You belong to it now, to us." Thomas's heart beat faster. He didn't have time to think. The darkness was closing in around him, the figures floating closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the smell of souls consumed by the statue. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating him. He turned, stumbling toward the crack from which he had emerged. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift, closing in, but Thomas didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to get out. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. Once it takes you, it never lets go. He pushed himself harder, using every ounce of his remaining strength to climb back toward the crack in the wall. His breath was ragged, his body screaming in pain, but he didn't care. The hands of the figures reached out for him, their ghostly fingers brushing against his skin. But he was too quick, too desperate. Finally his hands found the edge of the crack. He pulled himself up, gasping for air, and with one last desperate lunge, he threw himself through the opening. The world shifted again, and suddenly Thomas was no longer in the cavern. His heart still pounded in his chest, and his mind was spinning. He could taste the thick metallic flavor of fear in his mouth. He blinked, disoriented, and realized with a shock that he was back in the park, the very same park where the statue stood. But something was different. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow across the scene. The statue was still there, just as it had always been, but it was different now. The cracks in its surface were larger, deeper, as if the stone was on the verge of shattering completely. The hand, the one that had pulled him into the cavern, was raised again, as though beckoning him. He stumbled back, his body aching with the remnants of the pull he'd felt within the cavern. It couldn't be real. He had just escaped. There was no way the statue could still. But then a voice, familiar and cold, whispered in his ear, "You cannot leave, not yet." Thomas spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The figure of his grandfather, Elias, stood in front of him, his hollow eyes staring at him with an intensity that made the blood run cold in his veins. "Granddad, you." Thomas's voice faltered, as he saw the truth in his grandfather's eyes. Elias's body was translucent, fading, but his presence was still there. And something else, something darker, lingered within him. Elias's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "It is not as you think, Thomas. You may have escaped, but you are not free." His voice was like a chant, a dark, hypnotic rhythm that settled over Thomas's senses, pulling at his very being. His skin prickled as his grandfather's figure moved closer, his footsteps soundless, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. "I tried to warn you, but now, it's too late." Thomas's body locked up. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His grandfather reached out with a cold hand, placing it on his shoulder. The moment he did, the world around them seemed to warp, the statue looming larger in the distance. The ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to pulse, as if the very earth was alive, shifting, breathing. And then it happened. The crack in the statue's surface split open wide and deep, and the void behind the stone, the same blackness that had pulled Thomas into the cavern, swallowed the moonlight, casting the entire park into an unnatural, suffocating darkness. Thomas felt a scream bubble up from deep within him, but it was cut off as he was pulled toward the statue's gaping mouth, a void of terror that seemed to call him by name. "There is no escape from it," Elias's voice echoed, his words chilling in their finality. "You belong to it now." The blackness consumed him, pulling him into the depths of the statue, deeper than he had ever feared. Every inch of him felt as though it was being torn apart, not physically, but spiritually. The weight of the darkness around him pressed down on his soul, as if it sought to devour him whole. His body fought against the pull, but there was nothing he could do to break free. The statue's hand reached for him once more, its stone fingers cold and unfeeling, but strong, too strong. His grandfather's voice, Elias's voice, echoed through his mind, a haunting lullaby of despair. "There is no escape." No, Thomas thought, shaking his head violently, fighting the very instinct to surrender. He couldn't succumb to the darkness. Not like this. He had to find a way to break free. His grandfather, a figure he had once revered, had become part of the curse, but he didn't have to follow in those footsteps. He didn't have to become one of the twisted souls trapped within this living nightmare. With every ounce of his will, Thomas focused on the one thing he had left, his grandfather's rosary. He clutched it in his hand, the cold beads pressing against his skin like a lifeline. The ancient words that his grandfather had once whispered to him reverberated in his mind, louder and louder with every passing second. The prayer. He had to say it, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But the darkness pressed against him. The voice inside his head, the voice of the statue, began to speak louder, drowning out his prayer, drowning out his thoughts. "You cannot fight what is already inside you," it crooned, its tone sweet and sickly. You are already part of it. You always have been. No, he had fought too hard to give in now. Thomas gritted his teeth, pushing through the voices, the cold, the weight of the darkness. He forced the prayer past his lips, each word becoming a mantra against the suffocating dread that threatened to consume him. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, he chanted, his voice growing louder. The rosary in his hand began to pulse with a strange energy, a warmth spreading through it, that fought against the stone's chill. The world around him seemed to falter, the edges of the darkness beginning to blur and crack, like a fragile glass about to shatter. The statue, it shuddered, the ground beneath him trembled, a deep, guttural groan vibrating through the very core of the earth. The air itself seemed to buckle under the weight of something ancient and terrible. The hand, once poised to claim him, began to retract, its stone fingers twisting as if they were being pulled back by some unseen force. No, the voice within the darkness hissed, its tones suddenly frantic. You do not understand. You cannot escape the curse. But Thomas didn't stop. He focused on the words, on the rosary, on the words were ancient, imbued with power, with something stronger than the darkness that sought to consume him. His mind flared with memories, memories of his grandfather, of the warnings he had given, of the countless others who had come before him, each one succumbing to the statue's curse. But now he was different. He wasn't like them. I am not like you, he shouted into the void. I will not be part of you. As if in response, a terrible screech tore through the air, a sound so visceral that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality itself. The darkness writhed, fighting against the light, against the prayer, against the power that had been awakened within Thomas. And then something shifted. The blackness around him receded. The hand of the statue, once so strong, now seemed to weaken, its stone fingers cracking and crumbling, falling apart like brittle dust. The ground beneath him rumbled, but it was no longer a sound of despair. It was a sound of release, of breaking free. Thomas's feet hit solid ground. He could feel the pulse of life returning to his body, the strength of his spirit, rising as the dark force that had bound him began to unravel. The statue, no, the curse, was weakening. The figures that had once surrounded him, trapped in their eternal torment, began to dissipate, their forms flickering and fading, as if they had never been. The cavern of flesh that had once enclosed him began to collapse in on itself, shrinking, folding into nothingness. The black liquid that had threatened to consume him drained away, its presence fading like a bad dream. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the suffocating weight lifted. Thomas gasped, taking in a breath of air that was no longer thick with the stench of death and decay. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the fading light of the full moon that now bathed the park. The statue stood before him, its form shattered, its once imposing presence now broken. The stone that had bound so many before him lay in pieces at his feet. The curse had been broken, but there was no joy in his heart, no triumph, because as the last remnants of the curse slipped away, he knew the truth. The statue would never be fully destroyed. It would never truly be gone. There would always be another, someone else who would wander too close, someone else who would fall prey to its dark power. But for now, he was free. Thomas turned away from the park, the echoes of the curse still whispering in his ears, but he did not look back. He would never forget. He would carry the weight of the curse within him, always. But for now, he was free. Thank you for reading through this journey with me. What do you think happened next for Thomas? Do you believe the curse is truly broken, or is there something darker yet to come? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, like, subscribe, and share for more spine-chilling tales. The mystery continues.